The clock on my nightstand glowed 11:47 p.m. when I heard her car pull into our driveway. Ellie always made a point of being quiet when she came home late, but our old Victorian house had creaky floorboards that announced every footstep like a town crier. I lay there in the darkness, listening to her careful movements downstairs, the soft click of her heels on hard wood, the gentle thud of her purse hitting the kitchen counter, the whisper of the refrigerator door opening and closing. When she finally slipped into bed beside me 20 minutes later, the smell hit me like a freight train. Espresso. Strong, bitter espresso mixed with something else. A cologne I didn't recognize, something cheap and young and completely wrong for a 47-year-old woman who claimed to prefer expensive perfumes. "Adam?" she whispered, her voice artificially sweet. "You awake, honey?" I kept my breathing steady, feigning sleep. Her hand touched my shoulder with what I'm sure she thought was genuine affection, but felt more like a performance. The same way she'd been performing for months now, maybe longer. "I was at book club late tonight," she murmured as if I'd asked. "We got so caught up discussing the new thriller everyone's reading. You know how Janice gets when she's passionate about a book." Right. Book club. The same book club that met every second Thursday of the month, not random Tuesday nights. The same book club that ended at 9 p.m. sharp because Vivian Baker, the group's unofficial leader and local high school principal, never stayed out past her bedtime. I'd been married to Ellie Calloway for 22 years. I knew her lies better than I knew my own tools, and I owned a construction business. I knew my tools pretty well. The next morning, I watched her over my coffee mug as she bustled around our kitchen, preparing for another day at her job in human resources at the biotech company downtown. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd perfected the art of appearing normal, but I caught the little tells. The way she avoided direct eye contact, how she checked her phone 3 times in 5 minutes, the slight tremor in her hands as she applied her lipstick, using the reflection in the microwave door. "I might be late again tonight," she said, not looking at me. "The book club is thinking of adding an extra meeting this week. We're behind on our reading schedule." "Which book?" I asked, taking a sip of my coffee. It was good coffee. I'd always been particular about that. "Funny how you notice these things when your wife starts coming home smelling like someone else's brew." She paused, her hand frozen halfway to her car keys. "Oh, you know, that new psychological thriller. Very complex." "What's it called?" Well, it's hard to pronounce. For an author." She grabbed her keys with more force than necessary. "I really should get going. Traffic's been terrible lately." After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the ring of moisture her coffee mug had left on our wooden table. 22 years of marriage, and she couldn't even be bothered to come up with a convincing lie. I'd built this house with my own hands 15 years ago, back when we were happy, or at least when I thought we were happy. Every nail, every board, every carefully measured angle had been an act of love. Now it felt like a museum of my own stupidity. My phone buzzed with a text from Miguel, my site foreman. "Johnson project ready for your inspection. New guy's working out great, by the way. Kid's got good instincts." I typed back, "Be there in an hour, and Miguel, I might need a favor later." Miguel had been with me for 8 years, ever since I'd started Calloway Construction. Ex-military, reliable, and most importantly, loyal. If I was going to figure out what Ellie was really up to, I'd need someone I could trust. The drive to the job site took me through downtown Littleport, past the usual collection of local businesses that had somehow survived the economic ups and downs of the past decade. The hardware store where I bought most of my supplies. The diner where the town gossips gathered every morning to dissect everyone else's business. And there, on the corner of Main and Harbor Street, was Grindhouse, the trendy little coffee shop that had opened 2 years ago. I'd never paid much attention to it before. Ellie occasionally mentioned stopping there for her special drinks, the kind of overpriced caffeine concoctions that I couldn't understand the appeal of. But as I drove past that morning, I found myself slowing down, studying the place. It was busy for a Tuesday morning. Through the large front windows, I could see a handful of customers scattered at small tables, laptops open, looking like they were solving the world's problems one latte at a time. Behind the counter, a young man with dark hair and an easy smile was working the espresso machine with the kind of practiced confidence that comes from repetition. He looked up as I drove by, and for a moment our eyes met through the glass. He was young, really young. Early 20s at most, with the kind of lean build and casual confidence that I remembered having once, about 100 years ago. Something cold settled in my stomach as I continued driving to the job site. It wasn't proof of anything, not yet, but it was a piece of a puzzle I was just beginning to understand. The Johnson project was a kitchen renovation in one of the older neighborhoods, the kind of work I'd built my reputation on. Attention to detail, quality materials, and the ability to see problems before they became disasters. Miguel was waiting for me with his usual clipboard full of notes and observations. "Morning, boss. Cabinet installation went smooth yesterday. Plumbing inspections scheduled for Thursday." He handed me the clipboard, then lowered his voice. "Everything okay? You look like someone stole your lunch money." Miguel had a way of reading people that had probably kept him alive during his 2 tours overseas. I wasn't surprised he'd picked up on my mood. "Just some personal stuff I need to figure out," I said, scanning his notes. "That favor I mentioned, I might need some help with surveillance equipment. Nothing illegal, just domestic." He nodded slowly. "Wife troubles?" "Maybe. Probably. I don't know yet." I handed the clipboard back. "Can you handle things here for a few hours? I need to do some research." "Course. Take your time, boss." "And Adam?" He put his hand on my shoulder. "Whatever's going on, you got people in your corner." I spent the next 3 hours at the public library, using their computers to do the kind of research I'd never imagined I'd need to do about my own wife. Social media accounts, public records, anything that might give me a clearer picture of what she'd been up to. What I found was interesting. Ellie's social media presence had changed dramatically over the past 6 months. Where she used to post photos of us together, our house, her work events, now her posts were carefully curated to exclude me almost entirely. Lots of photos of coffee cups, artfully arranged book club selections, and cryptic quotes about finding yourself and embracing change. But it was the comments that really caught my attention. The same names appearing over and over, Janice, Lila, Maggie, her book club friends, and scattered throughout likes and brief comments from someone named Jeremy Baker. Jeremy Baker. I wrote the name down, then spent another hour digging into public records. 22 years old, rented an apartment at Seaside Gardens, the complex about 2 miles from downtown. No criminal record, attended community college part-time, currently employed at Grindhouse Coffee, the young man I'd seen through the window that morning. I sat back in the uncomfortable library chair, staring at the computer screen. Jeremy Baker, 22 years old, young enough to be our son, if we'd had children. Young enough to see a 47-year-old woman as sophisticated and worldly instead of what she actually was, a middle-aged woman having some kind of crisis. But I still didn't have proof. Suspicion wasn't evidence, and evidence was what I needed before I made any moves. That evening, I waited for Ellie to come home. She arrived at 11:52 p.m., 5 minutes later than the night before. Same careful footsteps, same performance of consideration for her sleeping husband, same smell of espresso and cheap cologne clinging to her clothes. This time, I was ready. The next Tuesday, I called in sick for the first time in 3 years. Miguel didn't ask questions. He just told me to take care of myself and promised to handle the crew. By 2:30 p.m., I was parked across the street from Seaside Gardens apartment complex, my truck positioned behind a delivery van where I had a clear view of the parking lot, but remained mostly hidden. Ellie's silver Honda Accord pulled into the lot at 3:17 p.m. I watched her park near Building C, check her appearance in the rearview mirror, then walked to the entrance with the kind of purposeful stride that spoke of familiarity. She had a key. She didn't need to be buzzed in. She disappeared into the building, and I settled in to wait. 3 hours and 14 minutes later, she emerged. Her hair was different, messier, like she'd been running her fingers through it. Her blouse was wrinkled in a way that suggested it had been removed and put back on hastily. She walked to her car without the confident stride she'd had going in, looking around nervously as if she expected someone to be watching. She was right to be nervous. I followed her home from a distance, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd just witnessed. 3 hours. She'd spent 3 hours in that apartment building on a Tuesday afternoon when she was supposed to be at work. When I'd called her office the week before to surprise her with lunch plans, her assistant had told me Ellie was in meetings all afternoon. Some meeting. The next Tuesday, I was there again. Same time, same result. Ellie arrived at 3:15 p.m., stayed until 6:28 p.m., left looking disheveled and guilty. The Tuesday after that, I brought a camera. The photos were damning in their mundane clarity. Ellie's car in the parking lot. Ellie walking into Building C. Timestamps that proved she was lying about her whereabouts during work hours. But I needed more than just proof of her presence. I needed to confirm who she was seeing. That's where Miguel's contacts came in handy. "You sure about this, boss?" he asked as he handed me the small surveillance camera. "Once you know for sure, you can't unknow it." "I'm sure." I tucked the device into my jacket pocket. "How long will the battery last?" 12 hours easy. Just stick it somewhere with a clear view of the apartment entrance. Motion activated so it won't waste storage on empty footage. I positioned the camera in a small tree near Building C's entrance the night before the 4th Tuesday. By Wednesday evening, I had everything I needed. The footage was crystal clear. Ellie arriving alone, using her key to enter the building. 20 minutes later, a young man leaving, Jeremy Baker, the barista from Grindhouse. He walked to a beat-up Honda Civic, drove away, and returned an hour later with takeout bags from the Thai restaurant downtown. But the most damning footage came from their departure. They left together, Jeremy's arm around Ellie's waist as they walked to her car. She stood on her tiptoes to give him what was clearly not a motherly goodbye, her hands tangled in his hair, his hands on her hips. 22 years old, young enough to be the son she'd always claimed she didn't want. I sat in my home office that night staring at the photos spread across my desk like evidence in a criminal case. In a way, that's exactly what they were. Evidence of betrayal, of lies, of the systematic destruction of everything I'd thought my marriage was. But as I studied the images, something else began to take shape in my mind. A plan. Not just to confront Ellie about her affair, but to make sure she understood exactly what she'd thrown away and what it was going to cost her. I pulled up the membership list for her book club, information that was surprisingly easy to find on the library's community events page. 7 women meeting twice monthly to discuss literature and, if I knew anything about small-town social dynamics, to share gossip about everyone who wasn't in the room. Janice Morrison, 45, works at the bank. Lila Hendricks, 52, retired nurse. Maggie Chen, 41, owns the flower shop downtown. Patricia Williams, 48, substitute teacher. Sandra Thompson, 39, stay-at-home mom with 3 kids. And Vivian Baker, 53, high school principal. Baker, the same last name as Jeremy. It took me exactly 15 minutes to confirm what I'd already suspected. Public records showed Vivian Baker as Jeremy's mother. The same Vivian Baker who sat in a circle twice a month with my wife, discussing books and life and probably sharing stories about their families. The same Vivian Baker who had no idea that her 22-year-old son was having an affair with one of her book club friends. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face for the first time in weeks. This wasn't just about exposing Ellie's affair anymore. This was about making sure she understood that actions have consequences, and that some consequences are more public than others. The next book club meeting was Thursday night. I had 2 days to prepare. I spent Wednesday morning at the print shop downtown, making copies of the most damning photographs. Nothing explicit. I wasn't interested in traumatizing a group of middle-aged women, but clear evidence of the affair. Ellie and Jeremy entering the apartment building together. The goodbye scene in the parking lot. Time stamps that proved this wasn't a one-time occurrence. I also printed out Jeremy's lease agreement, which I'd obtained through a contact in the property management business. Public records that clearly showed his age, his address, and most importantly, his mother's name, listed as his emergency contact. That afternoon, I drove past Grindhouse again. Jeremy was working, his easy smile charming the customers as he crafted their overpriced coffee drinks. He looked even younger in person than he had in the surveillance footage, barely out of college, probably still figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. What he definitely shouldn't have been doing was having an affair with a married woman old enough to be his mother. A married woman who happened to be friends with his actual mother. I parked across the street and watched him work for 20 minutes, studying his movements, his interactions with customers. He was good at his job. I'd give him that. Friendly without being pushy, efficient without seeming rushed. Under different circumstances, I might have even liked him. But these weren't different circumstances. My phone buzzed with a text from Ellie. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." It was Wednesday, not her usual Tuesday pattern, but apparently she was expanding her schedule. I typed back, "No problem. Love you." The lie tasted bitter, but it was necessary. I needed her to think everything was normal until Thursday night. Until I was ready to detonate the bomb she'd built with her own choices. That evening, I sat in my workshop in the basement, surrounded by the tools of my trade and the evidence of my wife's betrayal. 22 years of marriage, reduced to a manila envelope full of photographs and documents. But as I sat there, I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore. The rage that had been burning in my chest for weeks had transformed into something colder, more calculating. I wasn't interested in screaming or throwing things or making dramatic gestures that would only make me look like the wronged husband having a breakdown. I was interested in justice, the kind of justice that comes from letting people see the truth about someone they thought they knew. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Littleport look like a postcard. I sat in my truck outside the community center, watching as the book club members arrived one by one. Janice Morrison pulled up in her pristine SUV, chatting on her phone as she walked toward the building. Lila Hendricks arrived next, carrying what looked like homemade cookies in a covered dish. Then Maggie, Sandra, and Patricia, all of them looking like the respectable middle-aged women they were. Vivian Baker was the last to arrive, driving a sensible sedan and carrying herself with the no-nonsense bearing of someone who'd spent decades managing teenagers. She looked exactly like what she was, a high school principal, a pillar of the community, a woman who expected others to live up to the same standards she set for herself. Ellie's car was already there, parked in her usual spot near the side entrance. I waited 15 minutes after Vivian went inside, giving them time to settle into their routine. The manila envelope sat on the passenger seat beside me, thick with photographs and documents that were about to change several lives forever. The community center was one of those generic municipal buildings that served a dozen different purposes throughout the week. Tonight, the book club had claimed the small conference room on the first floor. Through the windows, I could see them arranged in their usual circle, coffee cups and notebooks scattered on the table between them. I walked through the main entrance like I belonged there, nodding to the security guard who knew me from various community meetings over the years. The book club room was easy to find. I could hear their voices drifting down the hallway, animated discussion about character development and plot twists. I knocked twice on the door frame and stepped into the room. "Ladies, I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, keeping my voice calm and apologetic. "Ellie, there's been a family emergency. I need to speak with you and the group for just a moment. 7 faces turned toward me with varying expressions of surprise and concern. Ellie's face went pale, her coffee cup freezing halfway to her lips. Adam? She said, her voice higher than usual. What's wrong? Is someone hurt? No one's hurt, I said, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind me. But there is something urgent that I think everyone should see. I pulled the envelope from inside my jacket and set it on the table in the center of their circle. I've been trying to figure out the best way to handle this situation, and I realized that honesty is probably the best policy, especially among friends. Janice leaned forward, her curiosity overriding her caution. Adam, what's this about? It's about trust, I said, opening the envelope and beginning to distribute the photographs around the table. And about how well we really know the people we care about. The first photograph showed Ellie's car in the parking lot of Seaside Gardens. I placed it in front of Vivian Baker, watching as her eyes focused on the image, then moved to the timestamp in the corner. This was taken last Tuesday, I said, continuing to distribute photos. And this one the Tuesday before that, and this one the Tuesday before that. Lila picked up one of the photos showing Ellie and Jeremy walking into the apartment building together. Ellie, who is this young man? Ellie's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Adam, this isn't… You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, I said, placing the final photograph, the goodbye scene in the parking lot, directly in front of Vivian. The question is whether Mrs. Baker understands. Vivian's face had gone completely white. She stared at the photograph, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized her son's face, her son's apartment building, her son's car in the background. That's Jeremy, she whispered. That's my Jeremy. Yes, I said quietly. Your 22-year-old son, Jeremy. The same Jeremy who my wife has been visiting every Tuesday afternoon for the past month. The same Jeremy she's been having an affair with. The room erupted in gasps and whispered exclamations. Janice grabbed for more photographs, studying them with the intensity of a detective. Sandra covered her mouth with her hand. Patricia just stared at Ellie with a mixture of shock and disgust. Ellie always said he was like a second son to her, Maggie said slowly, her voice filled with dawning horror. She said he was such a sweet boy, always making her special coffee drinks. He is sweet, Vivian said, her voice gaining strength and anger. He's a good boy who's being taken advantage of by a woman old enough to be his mother. Ellie finally found her voice. Vivian, please, you don't understand. Jeremy and we have a connection. Age doesn't matter when two people really care about each other. Care about each other? Vivian stood up so quickly her chair fell backward. He's 22 years old. He's barely finished being a teenager. You're a predator. Now wait just a minute, Ellie started, but I cut her off. Actually, let's not wait, I said, pulling out Jeremy's lease agreement and placing it on the table. Let's talk about the apartment he can barely afford on a barista's salary. The apartment where my wife has been spending 3 hours every Tuesday afternoon. The apartment where she apparently has her own key. Janice picked up the lease document, scanning it quickly. Vivian, this lists you as his emergency contact. Did you know about any of this? Of course I didn't know. Vivian's voice was rising, her principal's authority kicking in. If I had known that one of my book club friends was seducing my son, I would have put a stop to it immediately. Seducing? Ellie laughed, but it sounded forced and brittle. Vivian, your son is an adult. He makes his own choices. He's barely an adult, Vivian shot back. And you're a married woman with decades more life experience. You manipulated him. I watched the argument unfold with a sense of satisfaction that was probably unhealthy but felt entirely justified. This was exactly what I'd hoped for, not just the exposure of Ellie's affair, but the complete destruction of her social circle, her reputation, her carefully constructed image as the perfect wife and friend. Lila cleared her throat, her nurse's training helping her maintain some composure in the chaos. Ellie, how long has this been going on? It's not what you think, Ellie said, but her voice lacked conviction. Jeremy and we just connected. He understands me in a way that… She trailed off, looking around the table at faces that had transformed from friendly to hostile in a matter of minutes. In a way that your husband of 22 years doesn't? Sandra asked quietly. Is that what you were going to say? I decided it was time to deliver the final blow. There's one more thing, I said, reaching into the envelope and pulling out printed screenshots of text messages. These are from Jeremy's phone. A friend of his thought I should see them. That was a lie. I'd obtained the messages through less legitimate means, but the women didn't need to know that. I placed the screenshots on the table. They showed conversations between Jeremy and Ellie, planning their Tuesday meetings, discussing how to keep their relationship secret, and most damning of all, Jeremy referring to the book club meetings as when my mom hangs out with my girlfriend's friends. Vivian read the messages, her face cycling through several shades of red. When she looked up at Ellie, her eyes were filled with a rage I'd rarely seen outside of courtroom dramas. You've been sitting in this room for months, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Sitting here with me, talking about books, sharing coffee and cookies, all while you were sleeping with my son, my 22-year-old son. Vivian, please! Don't. Vivian held up a hand. Don't you dare try to justify this. You're disgusting. You're a predator and a liar and a terrible friend, and I never want to see you again. She turned to the other women. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm done. This book club is over. I won't sit in the same room as someone who would do this to a friend. One by one, the other women began gathering their things. Janice, who had been Ellie's closest friend in the group, wouldn't even look at her. Lila shook her head in disgust as she packed up her cookies. Maggie muttered something about always knowing something was off as she headed for the door. Within 5 minutes, the room was empty except for Ellie and me. She sat in her chair, staring at the photographs scattered across the table, like the remnants of her former life. You planned this, she said finally. You planned all of this. I documented it, I corrected. You planned it when you decided to have an affair with a kid young enough to be our son. He's not a kid. He's 22. When you were 22, I was already running my own business. Jeremy makes coffee drinks for a living and lives in a rundown apartment that his mother probably helps him pay for. Ellie finally looked at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Not shame or remorse, but anger. You humiliated me, she said. In front of my friends. You destroyed my reputation over what? Jealousy? I told the truth, I said. If the truth humiliated you, maybe you should have thought about that before you started lying. She stood up, grabbing her purse with shaking hands. This isn't over, Adam. You think you've won something here, but you haven't. Jeremy and what we have is real. It's more real than this marriage has been in years. Then I guess you won't mind if it becomes public knowledge, I said. Because after tonight, it's going to be all over town by tomorrow morning. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating the damage, trying to figure out how to salvage something from the wreckage. You're going to regret this, she said finally. Maybe, I said, but probably not as much as you're going to regret underestimating me. She left without another word, and I sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by the evidence of her betrayal and the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. But as I gathered up the photographs and documents, I realized something. This was just the beginning. Exposing the affair to her book club friends was only the first domino to fall. The real consequences were just getting started. By Friday morning, the story had spread through Littleport like spilled coffee soaking into fabric. I discovered this when I stopped at Murphy's Diner for breakfast and noticed the way conversation stopped when I walked in, then resumed in hushed tones after I passed. Tom Bradley, my oldest friend in town and a regular at Murphy's, waved me over to his usual booth by the window. "Well, well," he said, as I sat down across from him. "If it isn't the man of the hour. I heard you caused quite a stir at the book club meeting last night." News travels fast around here. Janice Morrison was in here an hour ago, telling anyone who'd listen about what happened. According to her, your wife's been carrying on with some college kid, and you exposed the whole thing in front of his mother. Tom took a sip of his coffee. "That true?" "More or less." "Damn." He shook his head. 22 years of marriage, and she throws it away for a barista who's young enough to be her son. What the hell was she thinking? Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message, then another, then 3 more in rapid succession. The first was from Miguel. "Boss, you might want to see the news. Local Facebook groups are going crazy." The second was from my neighbor. "Adam, if you need anything, we're here for you. Can't believe what Ellie did." The third, fourth, and fifth were from numbers I didn't recognize, but the messages were similar. Expressions of support, offers of help, and in one case, someone asking if I was planning to divorce Ellie and whether I needed a lawyer recommendation. "Jesus," I muttered, scrolling through the messages. "How does everyone know already?" Tom grinned. "You forgot where you live, buddy. This is Littleport. Population 8,000 and about 7,500 of them are related to each other or went to high school together. When something like this happens, especially involving the high school principal's son, it's front-page news." He wasn't exaggerating. By the time I left the diner, I'd received 17 more messages and 3 phone calls from people I hadn't spoken to in months, all wanting to express their shock and support. The drive to the job site took me past Grindhouse, and I couldn't resist slowing down to look. The coffee shop was nearly empty, which was unusual for a Friday morning. Through the window, I could see Jeremy behind the counter, but instead of his usual easy smile, he looked miserable and nervous. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Management reserves the right to refuse service to anyone." I had a feeling that sign hadn't been there yesterday. At the construction site, Miguel was waiting for me with his clipboard and a concerned expression. "Morning, boss." "How you holding up?" "Better than expected, actually." "What's the situation here?" "Crew's all accounted for, works on schedule, but—" He hesitated. "I've been getting calls all morning. Word's out about what happened last night. Some of the guys are asking if you need anything, want to know if there's going to be trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that happens when a 22-year-old kid thinks he can mess around with another man's wife and there won't be consequences." I studied Miguel's face. "You think Jeremy's going to cause problems?" "I think he's young and stupid, and probably doesn't understand what he's gotten himself into. Young and stupid can be dangerous when it's backed into a corner." As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Ellie's name. Adam. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "Not over the phone. Meet me at home in an hour." "I'm working." "This is important. Jeremy's been getting harassed all morning. People are calling him names, threatening him. Someone threw a rock through his apartment window." I felt a momentary pang of something that might have been guilt, but it passed quickly. "That's unfortunate, but it's not my problem." "It is your problem because you caused it. You turned this whole town against us." I told the truth, Ellie. If people don't like the truth, maybe you should have thought about that before you started sneaking around with someone young enough to be our son. "Stop saying that! Jeremy is not a child." "No, but he's young enough and naive enough that a predatory older woman could manipulate him into thinking their affair was some kind of grand romance instead of what it actually is." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long, I thought she'd hung up. "1 hour," she said finally. "Be there." The line went silent. Miguel had been listening to my side of the conversation with growing concern. "Boss, maybe I should come with you." "No, this is between me and Ellie, but—" I thought about Jeremy's broken window, about the anger I'd heard in Ellie's voice. Maybe keep your phone handy just in case. The drive home gave me time to think about what I wanted to say to Ellie. Part of me was curious to see how she planned to spin this situation, how she intended to make herself the victim in a story where she'd been systematically lying and cheating for months. But mostly, I was interested in seeing whether she understood that her actions had consequences that extended beyond our marriage. Jeremy wasn't just her boy toy. He was Vivian Baker's son, a member of this community, someone whose life was now going to be permanently affected by his decision to have an affair with a married woman. I pulled into our driveway at exactly noon. Ellie's car was already there, along with a beat-up Honda Civic that I recognized from the surveillance footage. Jeremy was here. I sat in my truck for a moment, considering my options. I could turn around and leave, force them to come to me on neutral ground. I could call Miguel and ask him to come over after all, or I could walk into my own house and face whatever confrontation was waiting for me. I chose the third option. They were sitting at my kitchen table when I walked in, Ellie looking defiant and angry, Jeremy looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Up close, he looked even younger than he had in the surveillance photos. His face was pale, his hands were shaking slightly, and there was a small cut on his cheek that might have been from flying glass. "Adam," Ellie said, standing up as I entered. "Thank you for coming." "It's my house, Ellie. I don't need to be thanked for coming to my own kitchen." Jeremy cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Calloway, I wanted to apologize. For everything. I never meant for things to get so complicated." I looked at him for a long moment, taking in his youth, his obvious discomfort, his genuine seeming remorse. Under different circumstances, I might have felt sorry for him. "How old are you, Jeremy?" 22. When I was 22, I was already married and starting my own business. I thought I knew everything there was to know about life and relationships and consequences. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from them. I was wrong about most of it, but I was smart enough not to get involved with married women. "I know it was wrong," he said quietly, "but Ellie and we really care about each other. It's not just some fling." "You really care about each other," I repeated. "Enough to lie to her husband for months? Enough to sneak around behind her friends' backs? Enough to put your mother in the position of finding out about your affair from a room full of her friends?" Jeremy flinched. "We never wanted anyone to get hurt." "But people did get hurt, didn't they? Your mother's hurt. I'm hurt. Your reputation is hurt. Ellie's reputation is hurt. The book club is disbanded. People are throwing rocks through your window." I leaned forward. "All because you two really care about each other." Ellie finally spoke up. "Adam, enough. We get it. You're angry, and you have a right to be. But what you did last night was cruel and unnecessary. You could have talked to me privately. You could have handled this like an adult instead of humiliating us in front of the entire town." I did handle it like an adult. I gathered evidence, I planned my approach, and I presented the truth to the people who deserve to know it. If you're humiliated, it's because your actions were humiliating, not because I exposed them. "So what now?" Jeremy asked. "What do you want from us?" It was a good question, and one I'd been thinking about since the night before. What did I want? An apology? A promise that they'd end their affair? For them to leave town and never come back? Actually, what I wanted was for them to understand that their choices had consequences, and that those consequences were just getting started. "I want you to leave," I said finally. "Both of you. I want you out of my house, and I want you to figure out what you're going to do next, because your little secret romance isn't secret anymore. The whole town knows about it now, and that's not something you can take back." Jeremy stood up quickly, clearly eager to escape the conversation. But Ellie remained seated, her jaw set in the stubborn expression I'd learned to recognize over 22 years of marriage. "I'm not leaving," she said. "This is my house, too." "Actually, it's not." I pulled out my phone and opened the Photos app, scrolling to a picture I'd taken that morning. "These are the property records for this house. It's in my name only. Has been since I built it 15 years ago." Her face went pale. You're throwing me out? I'm informing you that your presence here is no longer welcome. You can stay in a hotel. You can stay with Jeremy. You can stay with one of your book club friends. Oh, wait, you don't have those anymore. Jeremy tugged on Ellie's arm. Come on, let's just go. We can figure this out later. But Ellie wasn't done. You think you've won something here, Adam? You think destroying my friendships and humiliating us in public makes you the good guy in this story? I think telling the truth makes me honest. Whether that makes me the good guy is up to other people to decide. She stood up finally, grabbing her purse with jerky, angry movements. This isn't over. I have rights. I have a lawyer. Good. You're going to need one. They left together, Jeremy's arm around Ellie's shoulders, in a gesture that was probably meant to be comforting but looked more like two people clinging to each other in a storm. After they were gone, I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence of a house that had been built for a marriage that no longer existed. For the first time since this whole situation started, I felt something that might have been sadness, but it passed quickly, replaced by a sense of satisfaction and anticipation. Because while Ellie was right that this wasn't over, she was wrong about who was going to come out ahead. The real consequences were just beginning. The weekend brought a steady stream of visitors to my door, each one offering support, gossip, or both. By Sunday afternoon, I'd heard the story retold so many times and in so many variations that I almost didn't recognize it as my own experience. According to Mrs. Henderson from next door, Ellie had been carrying on with Jeremy for over a year, and they'd been planning to run away together with money stolen from my business accounts. According to Bob from the hardware store, Jeremy had been bragging about his older woman to his friends for months. According to the version making the rounds on social media, I'd caught them together in my own bed and thrown them both out in their underwear. None of it was true, but truth seemed less important than drama in Littleport's version of events. The reality was both more mundane and more complicated. Ellie had indeed moved in with Jeremy, but his tiny apartment was hardly equipped for a long-term arrangement. She'd been calling me daily, alternating between apologies and demands, trying to negotiate her way back into the house, or at least access to her belongings. Jeremy, meanwhile, had lost his job at Grindhouse. According to Tom, who'd heard it from his wife, who'd heard it from her sister, who worked at the bank with Janice, the coffee shop owner had decided that Jeremy's presence was bad for business after several customers had complained about being served by that boy who broke up the Baker family. It was Monday morning when things took a more serious turn. I was at the job site, reviewing plans with Miguel, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of Ellie's divorce attorney, a development I'd been expecting but hadn't quite prepared for. Mr. Calloway, this is Patricia Summers from Summers, Klein & Associates. I represent your wife in the dissolution of your marriage. I figured as much. What can I do for you, Ms. Summers? I'm calling to inform you that Mrs. Calloway will be seeking immediate temporary support, as well as her fair share of marital assets, including 50% ownership of your business and this house. I felt Miguel's eyes on me as I processed this information. Is that so? Additionally, Mrs. Calloway is prepared to file a restraining order alleging harassment and intimidation, based on your actions at the book club meeting and your subsequent behavior. My subsequent behavior? Throwing her out of her home, turning the community against her, and causing her emotional distress through public humiliation. I almost laughed. Ms. Summers, are you familiar with the concept of adultery? Maine is a no-fault divorce state, Mr. Calloway. Your wife's relationship with another person doesn't affect her legal rights to marital property. Maybe not, but it might affect how sympathetic a judge is to her claims of harassment and emotional distress. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Calloway, I'd strongly advise you to retain counsel. This situation is going to get complicated quickly. After she hung up, Miguel handed me a cup of coffee and waited for me to explain. Ellie's lawyering up, I said. Wants half of everything, plus she's threatening to claim I harassed her. Can she do that? She can try. Whether she'll succeed is another question. I took a sip of the coffee, thinking about my options. Miguel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Shoot. The surveillance equipment you helped me get, was any of it obtained illegally? He considered this carefully. The camera you used was purchased legally, where you placed it and what you recorded with it. That's a gray area. You were on public property, recording people in public spaces. Probably legal, but a good lawyer might be able to argue otherwise. And the phone records? The text messages? Miguel's expression grew uncomfortable. Those might be more of a problem. I nodded, filing this information away for future reference. Okay, I need you to handle things here for the rest of the day. I've got some calls to make. The first call was to David Morrison, the best divorce attorney in the county and, coincidentally, Janice Morrison's ex-husband. If anyone would be motivated to help me navigate this situation, it would be someone who'd already had dealings with Ellie's social circle. The second call was to my accountant, asking him to prepare a complete financial picture of my business and personal assets. The third call was to a private investigator I'd worked with on insurance cases, asking him to do a thorough background check on Jeremy Baker. By the time I finished making arrangements, it was nearly 3 o'clock. I decided to drive past Jeremy's apartment complex, curious to see how he and Ellie were adjusting to their new living situation. What I found was more interesting than I'd expected. Ellie's Honda was parked outside Building C, but there was also a second car I recognized, Vivian Baker's sedan. Through the window of what I assumed was Jeremy's apartment, I could see silhouettes moving around, and the body language suggested an animated conversation. I parked across the street and waited. 20 minutes later, Vivian emerged from the building, her face flushed with anger. She got into her car and drove away without looking back. 5 minutes after that, Ellie came out carrying 2 suitcases and looking like she'd been crying. She loaded the suitcases into her car, then stood in the parking lot for a long moment, staring up at Jeremy's window. Jeremy never appeared. Ellie drove away alone. I sat in my truck, trying to piece together what I'd just witnessed. It looked like Vivian had paid a visit to her son and his older lover, and the result had been Ellie's eviction from the apartment, which meant that Jeremy's mother had succeeded where I had failed. She'd broken up the affair. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Jeremy. Can we talk? Please?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "When and where?" "Tonight. Murphy's Diner, 8 p.m. I'll be alone." Murphy's Diner at 8 o'clock on a Monday night was about as public and neutral as you could get in Littleport. Whatever Jeremy wanted to say to me, he was smart enough to want witnesses. I arrived at 7:50 and chose a booth in the back corner where we could talk without being overheard, but still be visible to the other customers. Jeremy showed up right on time, looking even more miserable than he had in my kitchen 3 days earlier. He slid into the seat across from me, ordered coffee from the waitress, then sat in silence until she was out of earshot. "My mom came to see me today," he said finally. "I figured as much. I saw her car at your apartment. She told me I had to choose, Ellie or my family, my job, my apartment, my relationship with her, everything." He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug like he was trying to warm himself. "She said if I kept seeing Ellie, I was on my own. And I chose my family." He looked up at me, and I could see that he'd been crying. "I told Ellie it was over, that we couldn't see each other anymore." I felt a moment of something that might have been sympathy for the kid, but I pushed it aside. That must have been difficult. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. I really do care about her, Mr. Calloway. I know you don't believe that, but it's true. Maybe it is. But caring about someone doesn't make a relationship right, Jeremy, and it doesn't erase the consequences of your choices. I know that now. He took a sip of his coffee, his hands still shaking slightly. My mom made me understand some things I hadn't thought about before, about how my relationship with Ellie affected other people, about how it made me look, and how it made her look. What kinds of things? She asked me if I really thought a 47-year-old married woman would be interested in me if I wasn't young and naive and easy to manipulate. She asked me if I thought Ellie would have given me a second look if I was her age, or if she was mine. Those were good questions, and from the look on Jeremy's face, he hadn't liked the answers. She also asked me if I was proud of the fact that I'd helped destroy a 22-year marriage and broken up her book club and made her lose friends she'd had for years. And what did you tell her? I told her I was ashamed, because I am. He looked directly at me for the first time since sitting down. Mr. Calloway, I know I can't undo what I did. I can't give you back your marriage or give my mom back her friendships, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. Really, genuinely sorry. I studied his face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What I saw was a young man who'd made a terrible mistake and was beginning to understand the full scope of its consequences. What are you going to do now? I asked. I'm moving back in with my mom for a while. I'm going to look for a new job, probably in another town, and I'm going to try to figure out how to make amends for what I did. And Ellie? His face crumpled slightly. She's not taking it well. She says I'm abandoning her, that I'm choosing my family over true love. She doesn't understand why everyone's so upset about our relationship. Do you understand why everyone's upset? I'm starting to. He finished his coffee and signaled the waitress for the check. Mr. Calloway, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you think there's any chance that someday you might be able to forgive me? Not forget what I did, but forgive it? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since this whole situation started. Was Jeremy a predatory young man who deliberately targeted a vulnerable married woman? Or was he a naive kid who'd been manipulated by someone with decades more life experience? I think, I said carefully, that forgiveness is something you earn through your actions going forward, not something you get because you apologize. He nodded, understanding. That's fair. He paid for both our coffees and stood to leave, then turned back to me one more time. For what it's worth, Mr. Calloway, I think Ellie was lucky to have a husband like you. I hope someday I'm smart enough to build the kind of life you built, instead of being stupid enough to help tear one down. After he left, I sat alone in the diner, thinking about forgiveness and consequences, and the difference between being young and being stupid. Jeremy was both, but he was also learning from his mistakes in a way that suggested he might actually grow from this experience. Ellie, on the other hand, still seemed to think she was the victim in this story. My phone buzzed with a text from David Morrison, the divorce attorney. Can you come in tomorrow morning? We need to discuss strategy. I typed back, I'll be there. The real battle was just beginning. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in David Morrison's office, reviewing the latest round of legal documents that Ellie's attorney had filed. The demands had escalated beyond what I'd expected, even knowing how vindictive Ellie could be when she felt wronged. She's asking for spousal support, 50% of your business assets, the house, and punitive damages for emotional distress, David said, sliding the papers across his desk. She's also claiming that you violated her privacy by conducting surveillance, and that you intentionally damaged her reputation and employment prospects. Can she prove any of that? The surveillance part might be problematic, depending on how the evidence was obtained. But the reputation damage... David shrugged. That's harder to argue against, since you did deliberately expose her affair in a public setting. I told the truth. Truth is a defense against defamation, but it's not necessarily a defense against claims of intentional infliction of emotional distress. A judge might decide that your method of revealing the affair was unnecessarily cruel. I leaned back in my chair, considering this. What's our best strategy? Honestly, settlement. Give her enough to make her go away, but not so much that it destroys your financial future. Maybe 30% of assets, limited spousal support, and she keeps her car and personal belongings. And if I don't want to settle? Then we go to trial, and it gets expensive and messy and public. The whole town gets to hear every detail of your marriage, her affair, and the surveillance you conducted. Everyone loses. Before I could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Miguel's name. Boss, you need to get down to the grindhouse. There's a situation. What kind of situation? The kind where your wife is making a scene and someone needs to handle it before the cops get called. I looked at David, who nodded. Go. We can finish this later. The drive to Grindhouse took less than 5 minutes, but I could see the crowd gathered outside before I even parked. Through the large front windows I could see Ellie inside, gesticulating wildly at a young woman behind the counter who was clearly trying to stay calm. Miguel met me at the door. She's been in there for 20 minutes demanding to know where Jeremy is, accusing them of firing him illegally, threatening to call the health department about code violations. The manager called the owner called the cops. Where's Jeremy? Gone. His mom moved him to her sister's place in Portland last week. Ellie doesn't know that yet. I pushed through the crowd and entered the coffee shop. Ellie was leaning across the counter, her face flushed with anger and what looked like desperation. I know you people are hiding him from me, she was saying to the terrified-looking barista. Jeremy wouldn't just disappear without telling me where he was going. We had plans. Ma'am, I already told you, Jeremy doesn't work here anymore. I don't know where he is. You're lying. Ellie slammed her hand on the counter, causing several customers to jump. He wouldn't just abandon me. Not after everything we've been through. I approached slowly, keeping my voice calm. Ellie, you need to leave. You're scaring these people. She spun around to face me, and I was shocked by how much she'd changed in 3 weeks. She'd lost weight, her hair was unkempt, and there was a wild look in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Adam, thank God. Tell them to stop lying to me. Tell them to give me Jeremy's address. I can't do that, Ellie, and even if I could, I wouldn't. Why not? Because you're still angry about our relationship? Because you can't stand the fact that I found someone who actually understands me? The coffee shop had gone completely quiet. Every customer, every employee, was watching our confrontation with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident. I'm not angry anymore, I said honestly. I'm concerned. You're harassing these people, you're making threats, and you're acting like someone who needs help. I need help finding Jeremy. He loves me, Adam. He told me he loved me, and then he just disappeared. People don't do that unless someone makes them. Maybe, I said carefully, he realized that your relationship wasn't what he thought it was. Maybe he grew up a little and understood that what you two had wasn't healthy for either of you. That's not true. Her voice was rising again, drawing stares from the crowd outside. Jeremy and I have something real, something you never understood because you're too old and boring and set in your ways to recognize true connection when you see it. I felt a flash of the old anger, but pushed it down. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about a woman who'd lost everything, her marriage, her friends, her reputation, her young lover, and was desperately trying to hold on to the one thing she thought might save her. Ellie, I said gently, Jeremy is gone. He moved away. He's not coming back. You're lying. I'm not lying. His mother moved him to Portland to stay with family. He's starting over somewhere else, trying to rebuild his life after what happened. The color drained from her face. No, he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't leave me. He already has. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her processing this information, trying to find a way to make it not true. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and broken. But he said he loved me. Maybe he did. But sometimes love isn't enough, Ellie. Sometimes the cost of a relationship is too high for everyone involved. She looked around the coffee shop, seeming to notice for the first time that everyone was staring at her. The barista behind the counter, the customers at their tables, the crowd gathered outside the windows, all of them watching her public breakdown, her desperate attempt to hold on to something that was already gone. "I've lost everything," she whispered. "My friends, my marriage, my job, and now Jeremy. I've lost everything." "You made choices," I said quietly. "This is what those choices led to." She nodded slowly, tears starting to stream down her face. I know I made mistakes. But Adam, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to go back." "You can't go back. None of us can. But you can stop making it worse." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup. "What am I supposed to do now?" "You're supposed to leave these people alone. You're supposed to stop harassing Jeremy's former co-workers and stop making scenes in public. You're supposed to get help if you need it. And you're supposed to start figuring out how to build a new life. Without Jeremy. She stood there for another moment, looking lost and defeated. Then she picked up her purse from the counter and walked toward the door. As she passed me, she stopped. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For all of it. For the lying. For the affair. For everything. I know it doesn't change anything. But I am sorry. I know you are." She left the coffee shop, and I watched through the window as she walked to her car. The crowd outside parted to let her through, but I could see them whispering, could see the mixture of pity and judgment on their faces. Miguel appeared beside me. "Think that's the end of it?" "I hope so." My phone buzzed with a text from David Morrison. "Ellie's attorney just called. She wants to discuss settlement terms. Can you come in this afternoon?" I typed back, "On my way." As I drove to David's office, I thought about what I'd just witnessed. Ellie's complete breakdown, her desperate attempt to hold on to a relationship that had never been real in the first place, her final acknowledgement that she'd lost everything. Part of me felt sorry for her, but mostly, I felt relieved that it was finally over. The settlement negotiations took 2 hours. In the end, Ellie agreed to 25% of our assets, no spousal support, and a mutual non-disclosure agreement that prevented either of us from discussing the details of our marriage or divorce publicly. It was more generous than she deserved, but less than she'd demanded. Most importantly, it was final. 6 months later, I ran into Vivian Baker at the grocery store. She looked older, more tired than I remembered, but she managed a small smile when she saw me. "Adam, how are you doing?" "Better. Getting better anyway. How's Jeremy?" "He's doing well in Portland. Got a job at a bookstore, enrolled in some college classes. He's growing up, I think. Learning from his mistakes." "That's good to hear. He asks about you sometimes. Wonders if you still think about what happened." "I think about it," I said honestly. "But not the way I used to. Not with anger." She nodded. "He'd be glad to hear that. He carries a lot of guilt about what he did to your marriage. He was young and made a mistake. The real damage was done by someone who should have known better." "Ellie." She said the name like it tasted bitter. "I heard she moved away, somewhere down south." "That's what I heard too." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd been through something difficult and come out the other side. "Adam," Vivian said finally, "I want you to know that I'm sorry. For my part in what happened. I should have seen what was going on, should have stopped it before it got so far. You couldn't have known, and when you did find out, you did the right thing. I broke up my son's relationship and destroyed my book club and lost several friendships. Sometimes I wonder if there was a better way to handle it." "There might have been," I said. "But we all did what we thought was right at the time. That's all anyone can do." She smiled, and for the first time since I'd known her, it looked genuine. "You're a good man, Adam Calloway. I hope you find happiness again." "Thank you, Vivian. I hope Jeremy does too." As I drove home that evening, I thought about forgiveness and consequences and the difference between justice and revenge. I'd gotten what I wanted. The truth had come out. Ellie had faced the consequences of her actions, and Jeremy had learned from his mistakes. But more than that, I'd learned something about myself, about the kind of man I was when everything I'd built was threatened, and about the kind of man I wanted to be going forward. The house felt different now, emptier but also cleaner somehow, like a space that had been cleared of old mistakes and was ready for whatever came next. I poured myself a cup of coffee, good coffee, the kind I'd always preferred, and sat on my back porch, watching the sun set over the town I'd called home for most of my adult life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to build something better than what I'd lost. But tonight, for the first time in months, I was at peace with the choices I'd made and the consequences they'd brought. The barista's betrayal was over. My new life was just beginning.